How are you? Fine. Hi, Italia. Çok iyi atıyor.
It works.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Martin. I'm a journalist. I'll be your moderator. I cover the Arctic on a daily basis. I'm only here to make sure that you all are here and you're seated, and then I will ask the two organizing behind this event to bid you welcome. I want to tell you that we are streaming this event, which means that there are also people out there following us from abroad, perhaps from Greenland, perhaps from Canada. At least it's open, and I know there are people who are online. So welcome to you also. There will be an opportunity for you to voice your questions or remarks online. Please do that. We have an editor here who will forward any remarks from you to me in a very old-fashioned way on a piece of paper. So that should work. And of course, the rest of you are here also invited to share your views, your questions at all times. If you raise the hand at an appropriate time, I will try to make sure that a microphone is made available to you, just like in any other town hall meeting. But I think that covers my role for now. I will now give the floor first to Ambassador Robert from the Canadian Embassy. Dennis Robert, of course, is the Canadian ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark. Bid you welcome, and so will Charlotte Flint Petersen, who's the director of the Danish Foreign Policy Society. So, Ambassador, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, I am delighted to welcome you to the first session, Arctic Perspectives, a collaboration with the Danish Foreign Policy Society. Today, our distinguished panel will discuss the outlook and trends for the Arctic region in 2024 and beyond. The Arctic Perspectives series aims to create a space for thoughtful and thought-provoking conversations on topics affecting the Arctic and the people who live there, as well as to provide an opportunity to expand knowledge and networks. The series will consist of 4 distinct events, which will serve as deep dive into critical topics, including climate change and environment, the rights of indigenous people, state relation and reconciliation, security, and the evolving landscape of business, science, culture, and innovation in the Arctic. It is our hope that the discussions will contribute to wider awareness of issues affecting the Arctic and contribute to collaboration towards building sustainable Arctic communities. As many of you will know, the Arctic is central to Canada's national identity, prosperity, security, and values. The Canadian Arctic covers 40% of Canada's vast territory and is home to more than 200,000 inhabitants, more than half of whom are Indigenous. During my tenure, it was an honor to witness the resolution of the boundary dispute between Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark on Tartupaluk, formerly known as Hans Island, in June 22. The resolution of the Whiskey War made Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark the closest of neighbors, as we now share a land border with Greenland and a new maritime border of almost 4,000 kilometers, the longest in the world. More recently, Canada and Greenland signed a letter of intent for cooperation in the Picula-sur-Souac, a northwater of Polynesia, one of the most biologically productive regions north of the Arctic Circle, and a resource of great cultural and spiritual significance to surrounding Inuit communities. These examples outline the importance of resolving disputes through negotiation and joining efforts to achieve better collective outcomes. Canada is committed to working with international partners to uphold the rules-based international order in the Arctic. My own visit to Greenland have truly brought home how close Canada and Greenland truly are, through proximity and geography, of course, but also through people, culture, and communities, and our shared priorities. We are so pleased that starting this summer, regular air routes will operate between Nuuk and Iqaluit, which will further strengthen ties and increase opportunities for exchange across all sectors. At home in Canada, the federal government continues to make progress on advancing reconciliation and a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. Just last week, Prime Minister Trudeau was in Iqaluit to sign a devolution agreement with the Premier of Nunavut for the largest land transfer in Canada's history, 2 million square kilometers of land and water. The government of Nunavut and the people who live in the territory, notably Inuit, will have the final say on their resources and the development of their land. This is a historic step in the political and economic development of Nunavut and on the shared path of reconciliation. Internationally, working with allies, including the Kingdom of Denmark, it's part of our commitment to realizing a shared vision of an Arctic that is strong, prosperous, and safe. This includes ensuring healthy communities, growing economies, and creating jobs, supporting science, knowledge, research, and investing in infrastructure and maintaining security. We will not get there without strong alliances and close collaboration with our partners. We also need to listen to experts and those who call the Arctic their home when they tell us what is needed and what preoccupies them most. That is why I am grateful to the Danish Foreign Policy Society for its partnership and to the speakers on today's panel, Minik Rosing, Sarah Olsvig, Mark Lanting, Timo Koivurova, and Mininwak Kleist, as well as moderator Martin Bloom, for generously giving their time to share their insights with us. I thank them, and I thank you for your interest in our Arctic Perspective series. Before I close, I want to mention that when the panel will have finalized all of the discussions, they will have a little reception so you can continue networking and maybe asking further questions to the panelists who will be with us for maybe a few more minutes after the event. So thank you for your presence, and I pass the floor to Madame.
Thank you so much. And I won't take much of your time, just to say when I was approached by the Canadian Embassy for this series, I immediately said yes, because I thought it was a fascinating perspective that we actually could bring together, having the Canadian experience also into the discussion around the Arctic here in the Kingdom of Denmark, or in Denmark as such. And I think so far the collaboration has been fantastic and really proven that it is really worth the while, and not at least when you can see how many people have registered for the events today, also online. So without further ado, thank you for participating. I look forward to the discussion, look forward to your contribution, and I look forward to the panelists and thanking them also for their time. So Martin, here the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I got my own, thank you. And now, please, if I could ask the panelists that are here physically to enter the podium, and then I'd like to introduce all 5 to you because since you received your invitation, we have been able to secure further strength in the panel so that we now have 5 people who will address you from this floor. And I hope that we can bring also the 2 online people onto a screen now. That's always very exciting, whether it works or not. But here they are on a split screen. Wow, excellent. And one missing, Mininoak Kleist is here. I see him entering the room. He's now running. He's making it up here in a very short time. He's on his way. There he is. Yes, give him a hand. Thank you. And let us start online also, please. Thank you very much, Anna. Let us make sure that we have sound. And I can tell you, Sarah and Mark, that we have you very prominently online on screen. There's about 6,000 people looking at you now. No, a little less, but a very serious crowd is now watching you. You are on a split screen. I don't know whether you can see it yourself, but we're very happy to have you on board. And let me start introducing the 2 people who are not here physically, but very much in many other ways. First in line is Mark Lantane, who is Canadian, but not in Canada. He is assistant professor in political sciences at the university in Tromsø, also called the Arctic University of Norway, an expert, I dare say, in security, international relations, and the geopolitics of the Arctic. And I should mention that Mark will be teaching very soon also at the university in Nuuk in Greenland this coming April. So the connection is clear. And talking of Nuuk, Sara Olsvig is with us directly from Nuuk. She is the international chair presently of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, meaning that basically Sarah is the head of the Inuit Pan-Arctic organization that has for many decades now been a leading force of the indigenous peoples in the north. She was for many years also a leading politician in Greenland. And as I said, with us from Nuuk, thank you very, very much for being with us, Sarah. And to continue in the Greenlandic sense, Mininoak Kleist, who's here in the middle of the 3 gentlemen on the floor, is the permanent secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs in Nuuk, basically a very senior part of the administration of the government of Greenland, head of their foreign department, and just happened to be in Copenhagen, and we enticed him to sit right here amongst us, which is very fortunate. Thank you very much, Mininoak, for taking time. And you here next to me, Professor Timo Koivorova is, as the name implies, from Finland, a leading scholar when it comes to Arctic governance. I have learned everything I ever learned about Arctic governance very much from Timo. So I'm personally grateful for his presence. He's the former director of the Arctic Center at the University of Rovaniemi, very much based basically on the Arctic Circle in northern Finland, a little institution of 60 scholars, I think now. One of the great think tanks when it comes to Arctic politics, geopolitics, and so forth. And known to many in this country, but perhaps not to all in the room, Professor Minik Rosing, here on my right, left, whatever, is a geologist, head of the Center for Glacial Rockflower Research at the University of Copenhagen, born and raised in Greenland. And I'll just mention in this context, also the former head of the Greenlandic Research Council. Many other titles, but I'll leave it at that, Minik. I hope that suffices. And now the order of events will be that the 5 panelists will now be given a few minutes, and I mean few, I mean 3. That's 3, Mark, 3 minutes for their presentations. And the question that they've all been asked to address is, what are the biggest challenge or challenges and opportunities facing the Arctic in 2024? And they will have a free floor. They can sort of range where they want to go, but I have spoken to them beforehand. But I know that this will be good. I don't know whether they will replicate each other or say the same things. I don't know. I don't think so. But we'll start with you, Mark, in Tromsø. So if you please now unmute yourself, because I can see your microphone is off. There it is. And go ahead, and we'll see if the sound is right. And when you see me do like this, Mark, you see my hand? Okay, you know what that means. Thank you. It's all yours, 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much to the organizers. And yes, certainly not a big problem trying to summarize Arctic challenges in 3 minutes. I will do my best. Thank you. From the particular viewpoint, I tend to look at this issue in regards to geopolitics, which, as you can imagine, up here in northern Norway is very much a pretty strong concern when we're talking about the future of the Arctic from a political, economic, environmental, all of that. So in looking at the challenges, I tend to see kind of three major ones, which can certainly be spun off into other conversations. First of all, and the one that is obviously the most prevalent, has to do with the environment and how that is affecting not only issues such as climate change, but also human security. Now, we just wrapped up a very interesting COP28 session in Dubai, and it's been generally viewed that this was a step in the right direction. But clearly, the environmental challenges in the Arctic, they have not gone away, and if anything, they've become a lot more pressing. And they are being tied not only to a period of economic uncertainty, but also a great deal of energy demand. And as you might imagine, that's being discussed quite a bit in Norway as well. So the opening of the Arctic is prompting all kinds of questions about the development of extractive industries, shipping, mining, energy, all of that. And how to reconcile that with these environmental concerns is becoming very pressing. The other issue, though, when we talk about the environment is, well, what is going to be the reaction of many key governments in the Arctic to this area? We're all keeping an eye on November of this year, the US election, and whether we might be seeing a reversal of environmental policies in the Arctic because of it. This is being watched very carefully. So that would be the first issue. But the second issue, I think, is definitely getting a lot of attention and spilling a lot of ink lately. And this has to do with the idea of Arctic security, and specifically the quote-unquote return of military issues in the region. Now, we could debate whether security issues really left the region. That's a whole other paragraph. But certainly this is now starting to affect a great deal of Arctic discourse. We're now starting to obviously see the significant differences between Russia and the West spill over into the Arctic. We are seeing all kinds of evidence of how security is starting to affect this region from a military viewpoint. NATO has just added Finland. It is hopefully very soon going to be adding Sweden. Here in Tromsø, we have had the arrival of submarines, an aircraft carrier, icebreakers. Certainly when it comes to military security, the Arctic is no longer peripheral. So any discussion about Arctic exceptionalism, which has been obviously a matter of debate for quite some time, assuming that ever existed, I think it's safe to say that it is now starting to erode. And then third and finally, and this is kind of more of a slow motion issue, but it's certainly one which Norway is discussing quite a bit, the Arctic has become much more internationalized. We have Arctic states, we have Arctic governments, but the list of non-Arctic states who have entered the room and are requesting a greater say in Arctic affairs, it is growing. And much of the debate over this tends to focus on one single non-Arctic state, and that's China. The idea that it is China that is the gatecrasher, that it is trying to declare itself a near-Arctic state with no particular basis. But you look at the other major non-Arctic state players in the region. Let's talk about the UK. Let's talk about Germany. Let's talk about Poland, Japan, Korea, even Singapore, which is certainly not an Arctic state in the traditional sense or even an Arctic player. Many states are now requesting a greater say in Arctic discourse. Very recently, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, have been the focus of 2 Arctic Circle meetings, and this country is also trying to put itself forward in Arctic affairs. This leads to a lot of questions. The state of the Arctic Council right now is still a bit tenuous. Certainly, the situation has stabilized since Norway assumed the chairship. But there's still a lot of questions about the long term, about how we'll be able to maintain a certain degree of dialogue within the Arctic Council members on pressing issues like the environment, on issues relating to not only development, Indigenous affairs, and human security, but how this can be done under the current situation. And with other states, including China, certainly, starting to come forward and saying, well, we're not an Arctic state, but we want to be an Arctic stakeholder. Can the Arctic Council maintain itself under those circumstances? So now, I guess I'll end with this question. I'm certainly happy to pick this up later on. If we are going to be seeing the creation of, let's say, not one Arctic, but two Arctics politically, or potentially even more. One of my colleagues here even spoke about constellations of different forms of Arctic cooperation. How will the region adjust to that? So if we're going to be talking about geopolitics, yes, we can certainly talk about, again, the aircraft carriers, the submarines, and the icebreakers. But we need to talk about many other areas as well. And I see Martin standing up, so I will finish it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thanks a heap, Mark Lantane, a Canadian in Tromsø. Thank you, Mark, and I will look forward to asking you to take the floor in a few minutes from now again. Thank you very much. Timo Koivorova, professor in Rovaniemi, as I've already introduced. It's all yours.
Thanks very much, and good day to all of you. Can you hear me? Yeah. And also kind thanks to the organizers. So I will present two kind of viewpoints mainly from Finland, and these are to some extent contradictory, and also it perhaps tells you something about the difficulty of drawing conclusions about the future of the Arctic governance at the moment. So we did a report to our government after the invasion about the different aspects of Finland as an Arctic state, especially the cooperation with Russia in the Arctic. Of course, the country is half of the Arctic, so this is very important from the Arctic viewpoint. One perhaps surprising result that we got was that there's actually quite a lot of Arctic cooperation with Russia still. So we don't have any non-Arctic circumbite cooperation anymore with Russians, for instance, scientific collaboration, but we have governmental. We have also Russia pulling out of the Barents Euro-Arctic Council a few months back. So something obviously has happened. But if you look at the global level, global governance level, UN Climate Change Convention regime and International Maritime Organization's Polar Code, very important in the Arctic, both Russia is there. If we have the global regional viewpoint, we have the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. Russia is there physically and participating and virtually. We have in the latest biennial meeting of the Polar Bear Agreement, Russia was taking part in. We have bilateral levels of cooperation. So we have Finland, Russia having transfrontier water cooperation, Norway in many fields, also fisheries cooperation, and also USA having search and rescue cooperation with Russia. And we have also Arctic Council having a limited resumption of its activities. Of course, now with the Norway having a chairship, their stated aim is to resume the cooperation in the working group. So of course, this will be this will take time, but there's something happening. The second message I have is really very different. So I'm also the current chair of the Finnish Arctic Society, and the way these Arctic and Northern issues are being seen nowadays in Finland is totally different from pre-invasion. So we obviously have a fundamental change in the way we in Finland treat the defense and security issues, obviously, with the NATO membership. And obviously we have a totally changed relationship to our eastern neighbor, Russia. So that's a fundamental change. We have a severe situation at the moment when Russia started to send refugees to our eastern border, over 1,300 kilometers with Russia, and basically our eastern border is now closed. So this has influence on how we see these Northern Arctic issues. One example being, for instance, we have this long debate about the Arctic Railway to secure a passage to the Barents Sea. Now it is being not anymore seen as an economic viability issue. It is seen as a security of supply issue for Finland. And we have now the presidential elections in Finland, and all the 9 candidates we will have just in a week. We will have the election day. All the 9 candidates are very consistent and of similar view of how to develop northern Finland, and it is very much from the viewpoint of hard security.
Thank you, Timo. Thanks very much. And you, of course, will have the floor again in a few minutes. Sara Olsvig in Nuuk is next in line. I hope we can get her back on screen. Here we go. Sara, please take the floor.
Bojana, and thank you also for the invitation to all of you, Excellencies, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be online from Nuuk. I'm sorry I was not able to travel to Copenhagen this week. I'm leaving later this week for Norway for other meetings, including the meeting between the Arctic Council SAO chair and the permanent participants. So I can confirm that there are activities in the Arctic Council. So the Inuit Circumpolar Council, as Martin already said, represent Inuit across Inuit Nunat, as we call it. If you imagine the map of the Arctic right now, you will easily see that we are a marine people. We live across the coast, along the coast, and across the Arctic. And not only the land that we live on, but also the sea and marine areas are of extreme importance to us. And especially if you think about, as His Excellency the Ambassador was mentioning, the Pikialasorsuaq initiative to initiate indigenous-led marine governance and conservation initiatives in between 2 states. This is a good example of what our everyday life looks like as Inuit, that our living resources, of course, do not stop at a state border drawn on a map, but that they go across the state borders. So our people live in Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and Chukotka, Russia. And as an organization, we were established, founded in 1977. That was during the Cold War, as you know. So the current situation is in some ways new, but not so new, because we know how it was as an organization during the Cold War, and have been through the struggles of maintaining and developing contact to Inuit, our fellow Inuit in Chukotka, Russia, during times that were difficult. So a lot of the situation, or a lot of the consequences of the current situation are some things we have faced before as an organization and as an indigenous people. So if I'm to mention a few things that are important to note in 2024, I would say the Arctic Council, to make sure that we continue to have the political will from across the board to have an Arctic Council. And I'm happy to know that all 8 Arctic states have that political will, as well as the 6 permanent participants. It is a difficult balancing act, but it's not a new situation as such. And I think that we share the responsibility to steer our ship through those rough waters, and also make sure that we keep those lines of communication and cooperation open, not just because it's a political issue, but because it has real life on-the-ground consequences for peoples of the Arctic. If we cannot collaborate on managing the living resources, if we cannot collaborate on making sure we have climate data and climate science collaboration, or if we cannot make sure that we look at the Arctic as one whole region where peoples live across the borders. This also leads me to another second challenge I see in the years ahead, and that is the immense development we see on marine governance. We usually say from the Inuit Circumpolar Council that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was developed without the participation of indigenous peoples. Besides being a permanent participant to the Arctic Council, we as an organization, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, we also hold provisional consultative status in the International Maritime Organization, as well as participate as an ECOSOC accredited organization in the various UN fora that deals with also governance, such as the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, the plastics treaty negotiation, and other places where decisions are taken about the Arctic. So we often hear the words, nothing about us without us. we are exercising the thing that we do, that we sit at the tables where things are being decided as an Indigenous peoples organization, so that nothing is decided about us without us. And that's a constant struggle. So when marine governance is being decided upon in the UN, in other fora, and also it was mentioned that the Central Oceans Fisheries Agreement was mentioned, it is important that we are there at the table. And as an organization, we have paved our way into those tables, also the Central Arctic Oceans Fisheries Agreement, where we participate through our state delegations. So we are seeing a lot of development on marine governance, and we need to maintain the full focus on actually implementing those rights that the peoples of the Arctic have obtained through different international instruments. And in doing so, it is important that we ensure that those decisions are taken with us, and that also requires the political will of the states. So I'll keep it at that, and we can go more into depth in the discussion. Qujanaq.
Qujanaq, Sarah. Thanks a lot, Sarah. And I'll move to another person from Nuuk who's here in presence. Mininuaq Kleist, please.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I've scribbled a little bit down here for what I could say. I'll try to bring it a little bit down on what we're talking about. These important discussions on the Arctic and what challenges we have in 2024, perhaps for 25 and a few years ahead. And normally I would be saying climate. And it should be climate that is the most important thing, or one of the most important things that we work with and deal with, because it's a global problem. And you feel it down here in Denmark, and you feel it in so many other places in the world. And we feel it in Greenland. And every year we need to allocate funds and political initiatives in order to help parts of our population from what goes on with the climate. But we are in a time where there is a war in another part of the world. And that is affecting our region. It's stopping some of our cooperation, fundamentally. Now, we're in Denmark now, and many of you live here, and it's geographically outside of the Arctic. But imagine one of the most important forums for cooperation for your scientists. If they want to cooperate with scientists in neighboring countries, but they can't because of a war that goes on 5,000 kilometers away. That's the situation we're looking at in the Arctic, in Greenland. Imagine that within social areas, health areas, you cannot cooperate within the Arctic Council, one of the most important forums, with your neighboring countries because of a war 5,000 kilometers away. That's the situation. So it's not just geopolitical issues. It's people's lives. It's their communities. It's our decision makers that need to have the proper information to make the right decisions. And it's cooperation between neighbors. And that is what we are looking at. So it's important to take it down from all those fine, fancy words up there. Now, we have to work hard and fight for the Arctic Council. And we have to fight and keep and stay adamant at keeping it relevant, because there's no alternative. There is a quality to being Arctic. It's not that we're better than others, but we live in the Arctic, we know the Arctic, we're shaped by the Arctic. Like you're shaped by Europe. Mediterraneans are Mediterraneans, it's their quality, it's theirs. So you can only get the Arctic cooperation out of the Arctic cooperating with each other. Now that is in a challenging period of time right now. And hopefully one day we'll get out of it. And we have to. And then we have to cooperate. And it's also an issue, will also be an issue for Russia, because if they don't cooperate with the other Arctic countries after the war, or we don't, then there's the quality of the cooperation between the Arctic. And that's something non-Arctic countries cannot replace. Cannot. Now, we need to try to prepare the kingdom with the chairship from 25 to 27. And we do that, and it's important. And we have to continue as if it was business as usual, even though we know it's not. And we know Norwegians have challenges now with it. But we need to do our part to try and do our best to keep it alive. But I think, and we will continue to do so. But I think you'll see in the years to come more cooperation, especially in our part of the Arctic. The Arctic is big. It's not just one area. In our part of the Arctic, where you'll see more bilateral cooperations, trilateral cooperations, because we simply need to cooperate with our neighbors. There's no alternative. We have to. So with Canada, the US, Iceland, Norway also, is something we have to do also. We cannot just sit and wait on things not being possible under the Council. But we have to still keep fighting for the Council. Yeah.
Thank you, Mini Noak. Last but not least, Professor Rosen.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. I think that we have to break the question up a little bit. What are the threats to the Arctic in 2024 and forward? And that the Arctic is two things. It's a geographical region that's defined by some geographical features. And there's also communities, there are nations, and there are peoples in the Arctic. So I think to start with the Arctic, from its geographical definition, is an area where the summer temperature is less than 10 degrees C. So by that virtue, the Arctic might actually not exist by the end of this century. So I think that is a threat to the Arctic. That doesn't mean that the people who live there might not exist. I hope there's not this kind of relationship. But I think despite the fact that climate change is a massive impact on the Arctic region, I don't think it is the greatest, driver of change in Arctic societies. I think that still in the Arctic societies, the greatest change is globalization, urbanization, and also, of course, demographic development of the Arctic people. So I think that we see the Arctic has an inner dynamic that make a lot of the change happen. And actually, what I think is really nice to see is that the Arctic is gaining increasing agency in its own matters, and that means that actually some of these changes I think are positively seen from the Arctic communities, and I think that should be remembered. But then I think if we then look into threats to the Arctic, I think one thing that is often we talk about is military presence for sovereignty, whatever reasons. It could be interest out of a need for resources or an aim to extract Arctic resources and so forth. But I think there's one more thing that is somewhere on the horizon that we should keep an eye on. And that is basically that many people or many nations have interest in the Arctic also because the dynamics of the climate in the Arctic are shaping the climate in everybody else's backyard, basically. So everybody somehow have a right to understand what's happening in the Arctic and observe, at least have access to all the data and also be part of interpreting it because it is affecting everybody. But I think there's one thing that you start to hear a little bit, and that is that people start to think about, okay, since the Arctic has such a deep impact on climates everywhere else and living conditions for people everywhere else, and as this is changing rapidly, what if we start tampering a little bit with it? Maybe we could do something in the Arctic, forgetting that actually it's sovereign states where some people live and actually have their right to to do these things should they happen. So I think it is one of the things that is kind of lurking somewhere and it's not explicit, but I'm sure it will come and it will happen within maybe even this year, that we'll start seeing proposals to do something in the Arctic to save our own ass, basically where we are at home, and forget that there are people living there already. I think that's a threat that we should not forget. Then I think, on the other hand, one thing that is another derivative of the same observation, that the Arctic has a deep impact on the rest of the world, is that the Arctic also has potential to cause positive change in other parts of the world. And I think that the Arctic right now is seen as, is objectified in a sense that everybody wants to have a presence in the Arctic so they can study the region, do something in the region, but nobody asked the Arctic, what would you like to do with us in our part of the world? And I think that is a change that needs to happen. And I think that's one that the Arctic nations and people in the Arctic should really focus on much more strongly, I believe, than kind of structural matters about the we are all part of a very complex interacting world, but I think the main thing is for Arctic people to get a voice and an agency in affecting the development of the world as such by using some of the potentials that are in the Arctic region and that could change the world to a better place.
Thank you, Minik. And thank you for bringing also the positive aspects of collaboration into the field of vision. I think it's very important that we keep that in mind today. There is a tendency that journalists and other fools start talking about security the very moment they open their mouths. And that is a danger that we're all in these days, because there is so much security happening that we can talk about that all day, which we will now do. But thank you, Minik, for opening also the aspect of additional cooperation, additional agency to the Arctic peoples and nations. And let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Can you bring back, please, the two people who are online? Thank you very much, because I'd like to return to you, Mark. And I'd like to dwell for a moment on the issue of climate. Although, thank you also, Minik, for pointing out that climate may not be the main driver when it comes to change in ordinary people's lives, everyday lives in the Arctic. There is urbanization and internalization, globalization, etc., also affecting the societies, of course, in the north. Anyway, on climate, Mark Lanthain, as you know well, the climate is changing very, very rapidly in the Arctic. I think there's places in Siberia where the temperature has already risen 5 to 6 degrees, if that can do it. The North Pole will soon be ice-free in the summertime. Shipping is happening in places where it never happened before. For the first time in human history, a whole new ocean is opening for human traffic, etc., etc. It's really a game changer, as you started off saying, Mark. And I would ask you to expand a little bit on the geopolitical aspects of that. What exactly does climate change mean to the interaction of the main states in the Arctic? And here I include the near-Arctic state, as they call themselves, of the People's Republic of China.
Thank you. I would start off by saying that discussion about Arctic climate change up until very recently used to be considered to be kind of a far future issue, or at the very least, this is not something that we needed to deal with for another 20, 30, 50 years. And we're seeing more and more evidence that that is not the case anymore. We're now seeing a scenario whereby it may be possible to engage in shipping right over the North Pole within about 15 to 20 years. And as you point out, the geopolitical implications of that are very profound. You have Russia and China getting together, talking about the development of a polar Silk Road as part of the overall Belt and Road Initiative. You have many other countries starting to look at the Arctic as a viable secondary shipping route. But on top of that, we have issues of fishing, which has been discussed, as well as the fact that there are so many resources that used to be considered out of reach, too expensive to develop, that are now seen as completely viable. and how governments are going to be able to catch up with this very rapid change. The opening of the Arctic economically, in addition to environmentally, is something which I'm not completely sure everyone's completely thought out the implications of yet.
Thank you. Monique, can I return to you? You're a geologist. You followed the resource development, the minerals in the Arctic, which are often talked about, rare earths, and other strategic minerals who are increasingly important to the EU, to the Americans, etc. And there is, as Mark just said, there is a sense that these minerals are becoming more easily accessible. To what extent do you believe that these minerals, this mining bonanza, will take place? Will it actually happen, or is it already happening? What is the reality on the ground?
I think half of what you say is happening. Mining bonanza, probably not. But I think that clearly there will be extractive industries there are in a large part of the Arctic already, in Russia, in Alaska, in Canada, but in Greenland it will happen to some extent. But I think there's a big misunderstanding when we think that these are minerals that are particular to this region and that are easy accessible basically, because they are omnipresent most over the world. And the reason why we have supply chain problems and all these other things with these rare metals is that they're actually not rare, but they are rarely used. There's so small markets that very few people are operating in them. That means that if there's small fluctuations, then the market is not large enough to absorb those fluctuations. So it's really because they're worthless, so to speak. 99% or something like that of all metals that are being extracted are steel. And then you go, and these things are extremely small, kind of esoteric components. And that doesn't mean that they're not important, but that's the reason why you don't have a large capital interest in developing them everywhere. Otherwise, it would have happened. So it's been convenient that it was done in China.
And is it true that climate change is making a hell of a big difference in the accessibility of these minerals?
I think in rare cases it would, but I think not in general. I think that the accessibility, say in Greenland, as an example, is enormously good already. You have deep water access to just about everything along the coast of Greenland. The ice cap will still remain there, even if the climate changes, it will remain there for another 1,000 years. So it's not like we have vast areas of new deposits being. So it's actually much easier to extract this from, say, any part of Greenland and from central Norway or Sweden or something, where you have to build a railroad before you get to the coast. So absolutely, yeah, no, it's
And Timo,
but I don't think it will change very much by virtue of climate change. No.
Interesting. And Timo, from a governance perspective, we've heard a lot about I was about to say collapse, but that's because I'm a journalist, but the pause in collaboration with Russia within the Arctic Council, which is now the state of affairs that we are dealing with. We have no collaboration, or almost no collaboration within the Arctic Council with Russia, which is a problem in many respects. But what role does climate change play when it comes to Arctic governance? Does this alter things? Does it make the actors, the states, the peoples of the Arctic more aware of the necessity for collaboration in the Arctic? Or is climate change sort of a separate issue from governance in the Arctic?
Good question. Perhaps I'm taking it from this perspective. So if we think about what the Arctic Council has been able to do in the field of climate change policy, it's been able to come up with kind of adaptation actions for the Arctic states and peoples. It's been able to also come up with some even policy programs in reducing black carbon and methane. So from the viewpoint of that, and also especially the climate change science, which has been very important, that, for instance, the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program has been able to catalyze these massive kind of scientific publications on where we are with Arctic climate change. So when this is now not in a halt, of course, we are having a limited resumption, but we don't have much in the way of actual climate change work in the Arctic Council at the moment, ongoing. So this is I think a significant challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. And Sarah, I hope you can hear us. Yes, you can. Very good. Mininoat just put it very bluntly that the pause in the Arctic Council is devastating for very practical and central issues for the Arctic peoples. Climate change, you mentioned that also as a game changer, as a very, very important issue for ordinary people. Now, Monique said that, yeah, there are also other issues, urbanization, globalization. So can you give us a sense of your perspective from the ICC, Inuit Circumpolar Council? How large a life-changing factor is climate change at the moment for the Arctic peoples?
I did note what Minik Rosing said, and this is maybe one small point where I will contradict what Minik Rosing said on the issue of whether it's, if I understood correctly, whether it's an important thing or like a thing that is, concerning the minds of indigenous peoples or peoples of the Arctic. I think that it's very difficult to find anyone in the Arctic who have not felt on our own lives and bodies the changes. I mean, just my own example, I grew up in Qasigiannguit in Disco Bay, and I never hear the same sound of that kind of frost on the sea ice, walking on the sea ice, coming back there now, those decades after. Or the possibility, as my grandmother would do, to go in her car to do ice fishing outside of Qasigiannguit, that's just not possible now. Or Rimoussirsoir, the dog sledding race being changed in the last minute from one town to another because the sea ice didn't settle or changed in the last minute before the race was being held. Or as we have seen this year, the sheep farmers in South Greenland having to call on so many people to help them, including helicopters, to save the sheep because snowfall came at a strange time of the year in a huge amount. Or Avanirsuaq, where Inuit have not been able to hunt from the sea ice, making the government of Greenland, in a situation, or putting the government of Greenland in a situation where they have had to use funds from the from a specific pile of money that is for catastrophes to be able to sustain those families, affecting, as the child rights spokesperson said, more than 200 children in that area in terms of not going to bed hungry because of the lack of access to hunting. So as Inuit, I would say, as an Inuit Circumpolar Council, when we see coastal erosion in Alaska, some places 20 meters per year, or just on average 1.4 meters per year along the Alaskan coast, we see an average temperature rise of 2.2 degrees in average in the Arctic. And we see these changes happening right in front of our eyes. I think it's difficult to find someone who do not feel the changes. Maybe it doesn't take up the political minds of a lot of politicians or a lot of people in their everyday life, but the changes that they are happening, I think it's safe to say. At the COP28, we brought some specific messages to the world leaders, including that climate change is at its tipping points. And because of that, human rights are also at the tipping points. So when we do not act on climate change, we are also not acting on human rights that are being violated because of the climate changes. And this goes specifically also for indigenous peoples, including Inuit. And I think that in our governance, this is something that has to be top of mind of Arctic politicians in the years to come. We cannot avoid to act on it because our communities are so deeply affected on an everyday basis. So there is a deep connection between climate change and human rights, and that requires us to think differently of Arctic governance when it comes to climate change as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. And I urge you to raise a hand if you'd like to contribute in any way. You're most welcome. Raise a hand. We got traveling microphones that are available at any time. So please, and be aware that I will shift themes in a rather rapid way because we have a lot of ground to cover and very little time. So don't miss out on what you want to say. Raise your hands once you get the urge. That goes for you too, Minik. Would you like to
No, I just add that obviously it has enormous impact on people in the Arctic, but I was saying that for the societies as such, I think that still the main drivers are these societal. I think 1/3 of the Greenland population now live in Nuuk. They're not even out there.
Thank you very much. This gentleman has asked for the floor, and if you will, like anybody else, start off by saying your name and then take the microphone as close to your mouth as you can, and go ahead and pose your question or comment.
Thank you. My name is Árni Þór Sigurðsson. I'm the ambassador of Iceland to Denmark. Previously also ambassador for Arctic Affairs and ambassador to Finland and Russia. So I stick to the Arctic. And very good to see some of my old friends here. And thanks also to the organizers for organizing this this event. So I want to maybe raise two issues regarding the Arctic governance and geopolitics. First, I remember, because I was Arctic ambassador back in 2016, in the run-up to the presidential elections in the US, and we were all very, very afraid what would happen with a new boss in the White House as regards the US engagement in the Arctic Council. I don't know if you agree with me, but my view is that nothing practically happened. So why are you concerned about the US elections, upcoming elections now, if you know what I mean? The other issue is regarding Russia, because I was actually ambassador in Moscow when the war started, and we discussed a lot. Okay, we all thought that the war would last only for a few months in the beginning, and it would not have an impact on the work of the Arctic Council. Now we see that, or we don't see any end to the war. So how do you see actually the cooperation with Russia in the Arctic Council, or because we also have discussed, I mean, what happens if Russia pull out of the Arctic Council and maybe establish a new avenue of cooperation, perhaps with China. So if you can elaborate a little bit on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Two excellent questions. What's going to happen to the Arctic if Trump is re-elected as president? I mean, he's not the president now, I do know that. Mark, would you care to deal with Donald Trump, please?
Thank you. Nice, easy question. Well, my concern comes from two points. First of all, to talk about the past as prologue. You look at American Arctic policy under Trump, and I don't see much to distinguish itself. You look at what happened during the Arctic Council meeting in Rovaniemi. That was a very strong indication of just how much climate change has been downgraded, dismissed by the Trump government, and a resumption of that particular viewpoint would be disastrous, especially as at a time where we're all talking about we simply can't afford to waste any more time on this issue. The second concern that I have is that if you look at the specifics of the Trump Arctic policy, you see a great deal of erratic policy. There was discussion about a fleet of icebreakers. There was discussion about an opening of bases. There was a complete dismissal of anything having to do with environmental cooperation or anything to do with climate change. We have seen that the Trump administration had a great deal of wariness and at times hostility towards multilateral cooperation. So my worry is that if you get that viewpoint being transferred to the Arctic, especially at this precarious time, I worry that the cooperation that we need simply isn't going to happen.
Thank you very much. Timo Koivuorova, what's going to happen with the Arctic Council and cooperation with Russia? Is it true that Russia is looking towards an alliance with China to replace its engagement in the Arctic, replace the Arctic Council for a venue for Russian engagement and development in the Arctic?
May I first say just a few words about the Trump issue? I think that 2017, 2019, Finland was a chair of the Arctic Council, and I was personally part of the team, outside of the team, but still kind of working for the chairmanship. And I think it was a surprise to all of us that the Trump presidency went as far as killing the declaration ministerial declaration just because there is climate change mentioned there. So certainly it was a very, very difficult to understand the lengths and why the Trump administration wanted to go that far. Second question is just absolutely brilliant, and we are all trying to somehow work our way around it because we just don't know. I think I was telling about the viewpoint from Finland and also the way we are observing the Arctic cooperation with Russia. And there is still that existing, but obviously it has been very much overshadowed by these hard security concerns. And we have the Norwegian chairship doing absolutely wonderful work, but there's not that much happening. I mean, one project in the Arctic Council, so obviously there is something going on, but not much. And then when we look to the future, it's very difficult to say when and how this will unfold. It's just absolutely difficult. So.
And right beyond the ambassador's question, of course, is then the question of Russia's military posture in the Arctic. Very much discussed now, and we're not going to spend the rest of this session talking security, but we can't avoid the security issue. Mininuaq, what does it look like from a Greenlandic perspective? We have a very significantly increased US military presence in the Arctic. They now have permanent presence in Norway, in Sweden, in Finland. They have increased naval activities. We heard Mark talking about the nuclear submarines, the very increased presence very close to Russia's nuclear bases on the Kola Peninsula, where at least half of the Russian capacity for nuclear attacks on the US, for instance, is based. So from a journalistic point of view, the security situation in the Arctic has deteriorated, and this plays back on Greenland, which will now have to somehow engage in this, being traditionally very much peace inclined. As you said, that is still a priority of your government. So how does Greenland view this very somehow dramatic developments?
It's a challenge. It is, obviously. But we also have to view or consider the Arctic as not just being one region. There is a region that is part of Europe, and then we have a North American Arctic, of which we are part. We have a good cooperation with the Americans on civilian issues and cooperation within the Joint Committee, and we have on within the security and military area together with Denmark, the Permanent Committee, where we discuss those issues. And of course, our politicians also meet with US representatives. And from what we experience is that there is a good tone, a good respect of our position. That doesn't necessarily mean that all countries will follow what we do, but what we often think is that if we were not low tension seeking, if we were not actively speaking peace, if we were not actively speaking, let's tone it down on the military things. If we were not actively doing that and doing the opposite, saying let's do more of this military capacities and build-ups, I don't think that would be good for the Arctic. I don't think that would be good for the balances. So I think we actually make a difference. And I think some of us need to keep the discourse or the idea of peace and cooperation alive. And let's not only have this be something about what kind of weapon we have, because the other one has one that's bigger than ours. That's not the only way to live in this world, according to our view at least.
Thank you very much for making that clear. There is a very clear stance from the Greenland government on these issues. It's not very often that it's stated very loudly in this country, but I know of the policies of your government. Mark, I'm returning to you as our security expert here. NATO's General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg, in October last year, not very long ago, in the Nordic Council of Ministers, made it very clear in a publicly broadcast speech that he does not any longer consider the Arctic a zone of low tension. We've been used to hearing that for decades, that was the goal, that was the state of affairs, but now NATO's General Secretary is no longer of that opinion. What does this mean? How should we read that? What is the outlook for Arctic security?
Thank you. Well, the first point, and there's been a lot of discussion up here in Tromsø about this, about the whole issue of Arctic exceptionalism, that as soon as you enter the Arctic, security issues either vanish or they become less visible or they change shape or tone. May not be the case. That's a long argument that we can have, but I can certainly argue that the Arctic has now moved from a peripheral issue of many countries, including in Europe, with NATO, to one that is very central. But the question then appears, okay, what kind of Arctic security are we talking about? What exactly is in need of securing? What kind of security policies are we going to be seeing coming from NATO, coming from Arctic states, coming from other parts of the world? Are we dealing with primarily economic security? Are we dealing primarily with military security? This is the kind of conversation that we still need to have. It's one thing to say, well, security is back in the Arctic, but what form is it actually taking?
Thank you, Mark. And we have a question that was posed by a person who's following our conversation online, a parliamentarian from Greenland, Kuno Fenker, who's a member of the parliament in Nuuk, is asking what should Greenland and Denmark and others perhaps do to secure the waters and the freedom of navigation in the waters around Greenland now that the ice is less than before? Interesting question. Is there a policy on that, Mininak, by the government of Greenland or other contributions here? I'm looking also at you, Mark.
Well, this is a question on what should we do, and maybe this is a political question, partly.
Yes, it is.
So it is something that our parliamentarians should, in the end, decide upon. But yes, we have to do more analyses, and we need to talk and discuss between Greenland and Denmark, and perhaps also the US at some point, on how to best handle the new situations, and do it in a way where the different priorities of the different countries are listened to, and what is acceptable and what is not, and what is safe to do and what is not safe to do. I don't sit here and have the answer, but we have some work to do in front of us on that, and that's the closest I can get, I think.
Well, thank you very much. And this also, of course, brings into the picture the issue of the lessening of the ice cover of the Arctic Ocean, of the Arctic waterways, the frequent navigation now by ships from many different nations, etc., and the new actors in the Arctic, Singapore, India, Britain. A lot of countries now have a role, and they are asserting themselves in the Arctic. They're asking for climate data, etc. A lot of legitimate interests are being very visibly used and exercised now in the Arctic. So let's talk about all these new actors. What should be done to accommodate them, their legitimate requests, and what should be done with the requests that are perhaps not as legitimate as seen from the Arctic. I'd like to go to Sara Olsvig now and ask you one question. And it's been stated often that all this influx of new governments and the need to negotiate between governments, between the Arctic and the non-Arctic states, will threaten the influence of the Arctic peoples, those who are not state governments, but who are peoples in their own rights in the Arctic. What is your take on that?
Well, that depends on how good those peoples are at diplomacy, I would say. And I think that both Greenland and also the Inuit Circumpolar Council over decades have developed very good diplomatic skills and made sure that our voices are heard on different platforms. And this example I had of the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, is one of those examples when it comes to ICC's influence, at least where we currently have the provisional consultative status. We are issuing a press release today, which is about our new position paper on our work in the IMO. And there you will be able to read what we are exactly fighting for within the IMO with this consultative status to make it permanent from 2025. The very specific things that we are negotiating with the member states of the IMO and other observers and other actors that are related to the IMO is, for example, to reduce the underwater noise of ships. So how do we work with the businesses? How do we work with the international community in management of Arctic waters to reduce underwater noise from ships? Because we know that underwater noise has increased immensely and it is affecting the marine mammals and the ecosystems as we speak. So where I think that it's very important that governments such as the government of Greenland and others are very active in the IMO. And I would like to extend my gratitude to the government of Canada to working so actively within the IMO on some of these issues. Another thing we are working on in the IMO is to make sure that we eliminate the sources of pollution from not only the radiated noise from underwater radiated noise, but also the black carbon and invasive species that come with the gray water, and also that we make sure that we make some regulations on how ships and where ships go when they transit in through Inuit Nunat waters. We had some examples this summer of hunters in the north who complained of a cruise ship having anchored in a fjord where there would normally only be traditional hunting of beluga from Ayers. And this is just one example of how we see that the increased shipping will affect the local peoples of the Arctic increasingly if we are not there to make sure that the regulations are done in a way that takes into account the interests of us who live there. So I think it's very important that we look at all the avenues we have to influence international governance on marine issues, and specifically within the IMO. And here I think that our governments in the Arctic should be more concerned with the negotiations that are going on. Our delegation is in London right now, negotiating the issues of underwater noise. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity or a lot of prospects of partnering strategically in making sure that these interests are taken into account when governance is done, for example, on those issues. And just a short note on the urban Inuit. Urban Inuit also have rights, and the kids are also losing knowledge, traditional indigenous knowledge related to those activities that we would have in nature as the climate changes. So the rights are both for those that are urban and not urban. Just for a small reply for Minik, but I see what you mean.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Ambassador Robert.
Yeah. Thank you. I just would like to add a comment and maybe a question to what the member of parliament from Nuuk was raising, which is, yeah, the ice cap is melting, unfortunately. That seems to be a scientific fact. Some years ago, when I was in Brussels, a Chinese official told me that for them, it was not a question of if, but just when they will be able to navigate through the Arctic from Asia to Europe. So they see long term. But when we're talking about the governance, in my view, and this is maybe some expert may shed some light on that, but to me, the Arctic Ocean is international water. So it will be governed to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, as the Pacific, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic. So I'm not sure why we scratch our head and saying what it will be when it's all there already. It seems to me, at least.
Yeah, good question. Timo Koivurova. Now we're talking about the governance of the Arctic Ocean. And we're talking also, if I may, Ambassador, add to that, that the actors are interested. The interested parties are very many. We're talking China, we're talking India, we're talking Singapore, lots of Asian nations, lots of international Asian nations want to use the waterways in the Arctic. So what is the governance structure? Is it up for grabs? Is there no rules, or what are we looking into?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. So obviously, we normally, when we had discussed about the Arctic highways, it's navigational highways. It's going to be a northeastern, northwestern passage, and obviously we know now that the Northern Sea route, the one that follows the Russian Arctic coast, is very difficult for international navigation, which it was marketed for ages. So the Central Arctic Ocean route is indeed, it's a high seas, so it's a 2.8 million square kilometers of high seas. We just have this project actually in the Arctic Council, where we are looking into the uses, current uses, and perhaps future uses of the Central Arctic Ocean, and also what are we doing there, and what kind of legal policy mechanisms there are already in place. So it's high seas. There is all kinds of regulatory instruments, mainly in IMO, International Maritime Organization, the vessel-based pollution, etc. So Law of the Sea Convention provides the kind of constitutional rules for that area. So from the viewpoint of the rules, that's not a kind of problem. I would say that I've been following these Arctic issues for quite some time, and I guess that I've heard so many hype periods when we have been saying that, okay, there's going to be navigational highways that are being used, etc., etc. So I think that it's a little bit ahead to the future that we have to look into when we are discussing about developing it as an actual maritime route. So obviously there are possibilities for the perhaps longer term future than what we are now seeing.
Thank you, Timo. Mark Lantane, you were the first, of course, you were the first speaker, but you were also the first to bring into the picture this question of internationalization of the Arctic, the many new actors that have been seeking influence and a role in the Arctic over the last years. Why is this so important, and what are the positive aspects of all this global interest in the Arctic?
Thank you. Good questions. It's important because for a very long time, Arctic affairs were seen as primarily regional, that there was very little interest in the Arctic beyond the basics once you leave the Arctic region itself. But you look at the situation with the Arctic Council now. You have 13 formal observers that are governments. You have others such as Estonia, Ireland, Latvia that have expressed interest in becoming formal observers. You have countries like, as I mentioned, the UAE, which are now starting to get interested in certain areas of scientific diplomacy in the region. So it's becoming very difficult now. If I were to ask the question, how do you define an Arctic stakeholder amongst countries that are not Arctic states, the questions become a lot more complicated, because you can certainly argue that the Arctic affects many different parts of the world well outside of the region. So how can this be handled? Well, on one hand, there is going to need to be a bit of a discussion about, okay, is there a space for non-Arctic countries' governments to talk about how changes in the Arctic affect them, not only environmental, but also political and strategic? But there is an opportunity. One point that the Arctic Council makes is that we are certainly open to ideas from outside of the region, especially in the areas of addressing climate change. So how to best make sure that all of this expertise in the region, outside of the region, is well channeled. And this is one area where the Arctic Council, especially under very difficult circumstances, is going to need to address.
What is your take on all the global interest in the Arctic? Are there opportunities, or you talked about the Arctic peoples should take agency and make themselves known to the world and enforce their rights and their interests in a more sort of tangible way. Is that possible? Are there new opportunities with all the interest?
No, absolutely. And I think actually, to be exact, I don't think that the interest in the Arctic is new. If we look at least the North Atlantic region down into, say, Southern Europe and into the Americas, everybody have been going to the Arctic for the past 1,000 years for resources. And they will remain doing so. And actually, those resources are still probably the most valuable in the Arctic region, the marine living resources, I think. And I think that clearly, the interest from the outside world is important, both from a cultural point of view and from an economic point of view. You can also see Greenland has changed its export routes towards Asia during the past very few years. So I think that clearly there's opportunity. But I think what I was trying to advocate was that the Arctic should also start to find out what is the Arctic self-interest in making new exchange or interchange with the outside world. And that could be in defining new resources that we haven't used before. It could be services, whatever. But I think that I would just like to see the initiative shift towards what is the Arctic perspective on what we want to do with the outside world, rather than the reactive approach.
I think perhaps, Ninark, you said let's bring it down. Basically, let's talk realities. Can you tell us just a few instances of how your cooperation with China and the other Arctic or other large Asian states have developed just over the last few years?
In 2021, we opened our representation in Beijing, and the purpose of that is to work on the trade conditions with China. For many years, we've traded fish products with China, and China is now the biggest market for our fish. Of course, we need to try to work on having the best trading framework with China. We also have competitors who have better frameworks than us, and that would mean that their fish are cheaper for the Chinese consumer. So we need to do something about that. We can also talk tourism with China. And our representation in Beijing is also accredited to Japan and South Korea and Singapore. And all of these countries are also observers to the Arctic Council. And so there are avenues and angles for cooperation within science, within trade, within different other areas. We have a busy representation in Beijing. It's just started up, but I could imagine that in the future we have to invest a bit more in the manpowers over there. But that is, of course, a political question.
Yeah, thank you very much. There was an intervention from the gentleman right there on the fringe. Yes, please.
My name is Peter Brückner. I would like to move from the surface of the oceans to the bottom of the sea. Some years ago, the government of Denmark registered its claim to the continental shelf of Greenland with the UN Continental Shelf Commission. The area north of Greenland stretched about 800,000 square kilometers across the North Pole, and I suppose they are still working on it. Quite recently, the Commission had approved the Russian claim on the continental shelf in the polar seas, and part of that claim will overlap with the Danish claim. I would like to ask the panelists, in particular, perhaps those, Minwak and Minik, what are their views on the situation as it will develop over a number of years? Because the Commission may very well recognize that Greenland is entitled or has a continental shelf that stretches quite across the Russian claim. So there may be an overlapping area and a question, an issue that has to be solved. So that's my question. The answer, I know, is much more difficult.
Thank you very much for that warning also. Minuak.
I don't have all the details, of course, but yes, we have claims. Russia has claims. Canada has claims. Norway has claims in the region. And UNCLOS and so forth. The Commission has a lot of work in front of it. It will take quite a few years before all the different claims have been processed through the system. Hopefully, we are in a different place in the world at that time. But so far, when it comes to those claims up in the Arctic, we have been able to speak with each other. We have been able to talk and say that the Ilulissat Declaration is still having we've all signed up to the principles of international law when it comes to how to divide things, and that is something we will still remind our partners and neighbors in the region. It will take quite a few years still before we get there. It's not something that happens in the next 3, 4, 5 years. We're talking further still. And hopefully we'll be a better place for talks than we are now. There's no guarantee, but fingers crossed. It will not be easy. It will not be easy.
Thank you very much. I think that very much sort of squared the very difficult question of the continental shelf. Mark, let's just finalize this question with an answer from you. To what extent is the massive claims to the seabed in the Arctic Ocean a security issue?
Okay. First stressing that I'm certainly not a legal expert. There are people involved who are more qualified on the legal front than I am, but I can certainly say from a security viewpoint that it is not only important in regards to the opening up of sea routes and the question of these sea routes being securitized, being made into security issues. Just the mere fact that we are going to be seeing an increase of both military and civilian vessels in the Arctic raises all kinds of issues ranging from incidents at sea to the question of responsible behavior to the question of jurisdiction. As was just noted, we have Russia, we have Canada, we have Greenland, all very much involved in various claims, various maritime claims in the Arctic. And this also is going to be very important when we go back to the problem of the fact that relations between Russia and the West have deteriorated to the point where these kinds of discussions on a multilateral level have become that much more complicated. So we're going to be seeing an increase of both military and civilian vessels, and this raises, or creates, I should say, a brand new spectrum of security worries.
Thank you very much. Now, this is getting really, really technical and complicated, but it is important I just want to get to, let's see, as clearly as we can. As Minuak has said, Russia is following the rules when it comes to the delineation, the borders on the bottom of the sea in the Arctic Ocean, the question of who owns the North Pole, etc. Those issues have been dealt with so far according to rules, according to United Nations law of the Convention of the Law of the Sea. Russia has followed every sentence in that rule book. So, Timo, will they continue to do that?
Yeah, so I think that's one area of cooperation, that this is a global issue. So all the coastal states of this planet are making those submissions to the Commission on the Limits of Continental Shelf. And these are the extended continental shelves, so beyond 200 nautical miles, so very far out in the ocean. If we talk about the Arctic, there shouldn't be much economically prosperous stuff out there in those extended continental shelves, which take away the case for a kind of major kind of strategic competition between the states. And by and large, these are also very long processes. So the actual, for instance, let's assume that Denmark, Greenland, and Russia get their, let's say, claims accepted by the CLCS. Then it will be for them to negotiate the border, which means that this will take a long time. We know, for instance, from the Barents Sea that Soviet Union, Russia, with Norway was negotiating over Barents Sea boundary, maritime boundary, over 40 years. So these are happening in a glacial pace.
Not to speak about Hans Island, whom Denmark and Canada were disagreeing on for how many years, Ambassador? Was it 75? So in that respect, a tiny little island worth not a whole lot.
But there was also the seabed negotiation.
There was the seabed. That took a bit longer, yes. Anyway, it's your turn, please.
Thank you very much. Extremely interesting. Mauro Reina, I'm the Swiss ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark. A decision from the Norwegian Parliament taken, I think, last week was also in the Swiss press quite prominent reported. I must confess I'm not an expert. I'm referring to the decision to authorize under certain circumstances. I remain underwater. The exploration and also the utilization of seabed. Is this decision a precedent that will be followed by other countries of the region in the future, and how we have to interpret this as a risk or as a
right?
I would like to have your opinion on this.
Thank you very much. A very, very novel question. Of course, the question of seabed mining in the Arctic, the Norwegian government, as you rightly indicated, has just decided to start out on this particular path, and I'm aware that the Norwegian ambassador is present. So, should anybody from the embassy have an inkling to share information or views, you're most welcome. But let me turn to you again, Sarah, because here is also the question of rights and agency, etc., which involves the indigenous peoples of the North. What is your take on the Norwegian decision to allow, to a certain degree now, deep sea mining?
Well, first, I just wanted to comment very briefly on the discussion that went on just a few minutes ago on the issue of treaty-based negotiations or treaty-based agreements. Just wanted to note for everyone that this is a clear example of the big difference between the Arctic Council, for example, which is not treaty-based, but it exists because there's a political will to cooperate under something we call the Arctic Council, where we have 8 states and we have 6 indigenous peoples organizations. And then we have the treaty-based organizations, on the other hand, where cooperation have continued because they are treaty-based, because they are based on agreements that are binding. And this is the big difference I think we have to note in what decisions and what we do in Arctic governance to map out where do we know that we can keep a cooperation based on a treaty and legally binding with Russia, and where do we know that we need to have a political discussion on how to go about things. Of course, it's all political, but this is something I think is very important to remember when we talk about Arctic governance. And I can actually use that a little bit to talk about deep seabed mining, because I note, you know, Inuit Circumpolar Council consists of 4 branches, and I am the chair of the sort of international collaboration of those 4 branches. I note that ICC Greenland has expressed their concern about the decision of exploring deep seabed mining opportunities between Greenland and Norway, and I see that they have expressed their concern together with WWF, who are active in Greenland, and also Oceans North Gardasil-Unad, which is also a marine environmental organization based in Canada with a branch in Greenland. I think that we share a responsibility, all of us that take part in Arctic governance, to discuss in the coming years what we do with deep seabed mining in the Arctic. Is this something we want to work on in terms of creating a new treaty a new way of collaboration when it comes to especially the Central Arctic Ocean. And I think that here we should really initiate that discussion before too many things happen. Because as it has been said by experts, and I'm not an expert on deep seabed mining or the sort of scientific, conventional Western scientific knowledge about how seabeds behave when you start drilling in it. But I note some experts saying that there's not enough knowledge of the consequences. I could imagine that underwater noise, like it does from ships, will also affect the ecosystems and specifically the mammals of the sea from deep seabed mining. I presume that the Espoo Convention has been followed by Norway in making sure that neighboring states and governments have been heard in the decision. I look forward to hearing more from the government of Greenland, what has been, the government of Greenland's position in this hearing, which I presume has taken place because there's a convention on that. But again, I really, really would like that we also start discussing collectively in the Arctic of the future of deep seabed mining, because it will be a thing. And do we need regulation that is treaty-based, or what do we need? And here we will be following it closely from Inuit Circumpolar Council.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We are in a lucky position that the Norwegian ambassador has just asked for the floor. Please.
Exactly. Yes, thank you. Of course, we have noted that there has been quite a lot of concern around the decision by the Norwegian government, and some of it also based on not always based on facts about what the decision is actually about. And since I have with me my minister counselor, who is a lawyer and an expert of the law of the sea, I will actually leave it to him to explain the legal facts.
Kjell, please.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you to the organizers, and thank you also for all these interesting elements that has been raised. I have been involved quite a bit with Arctic issues in my previous job in Oslo, then from the law of the sea perspective. And I must say, listening to the discussions we're having now, it's very exciting. There is some new elements, but there is also some elements that we have been discussing for quite some time about foreign interests and how to deal with this and that, and how do we make the Arctic Council more operative. That was the overarching. Now to the issue of seabed mining. First of all, it's important to underline that the decision by the Norwegian Parliament is, of course, related to the Norwegian continental shelf. This is not an international issue. This is not about the Central Arctic Ocean. This is the Norwegian continental shelf that has been approved by the Commission in New York that was mentioned. That is only to square this from the beginning. Before this decision was made, there was a hearing where governments involved were asked for their opinion. And not only governments, of course, the public, NGOs and so forth, and there's been a lot of reactions to this issue. So that has taken place already. Now to the actual decision that is made. The situation in Norway is that mining that kind of activity is in general prohibited. You need a license to do that. So what the government has now done, what our parliament has done, is to say it is okay for the government to receive applications from interested actors who want to explore the possibilities on the shelf. That is the only thing that has happened. There is not made a decision to start mining. We are not at that stage at all. Before that could happen, it will have to be a company or some interest applying for a license, and if they get that license, they will have to have a description of what they want to do, where they want to do it, what kind of technique they will use, and so forth. And before an actual approval of action will happen, there will be further hearings. There will be lots of opportunities to shed light on the issues that will take place, or maybe not. And the issue is related to our history in Norway is to look closely at activity and consider the possible environmental implications. And if the environmental implications are such that this is not sustainable, those licenses will not be issued. That is the case. This is many years down the road, we will possibly see that action take place, but not before there has been a lot of work going into exploring how can this happen, will it be environmentally safe, and so forth. And to the issue specifically about cooperation on this issue, this is done within the framework of the Law of the Sea Convention, which is already there. And that framework, I think, is the framework we remain to work within, not only on this issue, but in general, as was pointed out by the Canadian ambassador very pointedly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ambassadors, for your contributions on this very, very recent development in Norway. I'd like to use the remaining time we have with two issues. One that we have already touched upon, which was described to me by a diplomat very recently as the freight train coming down the tracks toward us, which is the US elections. And we have dealt with that already at some length, but there's one issue that I'd like to return to, Minenok, which is the Greenlandic view on the upcoming elections. I know you represent the government. There are limits to what you can say. Well, we all know that the President Trump, when he was president, he took a particular interest in Greenland at one stage. And there's the security issue, there's the cooperation issue, there's trade that Greenland would like to engage with the US. So to the extent that you can you tell us what are the considerations in Greenland when it comes to the upcoming presidential elections in the US?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Let me first say right now that we have a very good cooperation with the US on within the civilian area and many discussions and also discussions on broadening cooperation. And I think we are at a point where we had a pause in our cooperation some years ago due to a service contract in at the time Thule Air Base. Now it's Bidufix Space Base. We decided to reconnect, so basically, and start cooperating again. And we're now getting into a place that I think is quite positive. Whomever the American people will choose or elect, we will cooperate with. We have a good cooperation with the current administration, and we know the former president showed an interest in Greenland, and we will cooperate with whoever gets elected after the election, and let's keep it at that.
Mm-hmm. And could you just as a list of, let's say, already shared knowledge, could you indicate to us how the present government is indicating its interest in Greenland? There's a consulate now that has been reopened after many decades of closure. There's interest in the minerals, etc. There are no secrets here. I'm simply asking you to share with us how you view the main points of US interests in Greenland.
If we go concretely into the cooperation we have on within the Joint Committee, we have cooperation and working groups on how do we start up trade between us. It could be infrastructure, transport cooperation. Today, at the present day, we don't have any ships going in between us, freight. We don't have any flights between us, and that is, in my view and many Greenlanders' view, not good enough when you're basically neighbors. We have cooperation within education and science. We exchange also within tourism, and we've spoken about cooperation potentially within health and climate, and there might be other areas. So There are good talks, concrete talks, but we do have the challenges of the lack of direct routes between us, that being ships or within planes or flights. And that's something hopefully that can be changed in the future. Yes.
Timo, just another question on the potential election of Donald Trump as president of the US. Would that make any change to the way Arctic governance is developing?
That's a very difficult one, obviously, and I think that because this is related to the general kind of geopolitical scene, and we know about what Trump has said about the war in Ukraine and perhaps cutting down the supplies of arms to Ukraine. So whatever will be that effect, no one will know. I mean, that's a significant challenge to whole of Europe and the kind of unity in supporting Ukraine. I said after the Finnish chairmanship, and when I saw the concrete impacts that Pompeo and his troops, when they arrived to Rovaniemi, and pretty much butchered their declaration, just simply rejecting the climate change. And I know the kind of lengths at where they were willing to go to just, resist the wording climate change in the declaration. So I wrote an opinion piece after that saying that if Trump will be re-elected, I don't think that we will have the Arctic Council. So I think that kind of there can be some indications in that how I'm seeing this. It's not going to be favorable to the type of pre-invasion Arctic Council reality, which was very much based on climate change, the activity within the Arctic Council. So I don't see it as a good development. No.
Mm-hmm. Any contributions on this particular point? You're most welcome. Just raise a hand. The freight train is moving. Anyway, one last topic for the last 10 minutes of our conversation here. I'd like you all to return to the issue that was raised by Professor Rosing, is the agency of the Arctic peoples, the positive aspects of cooperation in the Arctic and what that can achieve. Can we talk of the opportunities ahead of us? Specifically, we are in a Greenlandic Canada setting here. Perhaps, Mark, you could start out by telling us, why should Canada and Greenland work closer together? They've been lying next to each other for centuries. If they can't figure it out, why would they do it now?
Well, I think there are quite a few reasons now that have made themselves more apparent, which I think will certainly bring Canada and Greenland, and I should also say Canada and the Nordic region overall, closer together. We go back to the climate change issue. We go back to the pressing nature of a lot of climate change problems. We go to the issue of the fact that the Arctic is becoming more crowded. And I'm not just talking about shipping and potentially extractive industries, but I also discuss the fact that the Arctic is coming under a great deal of international attention. But we also come to the fact that there is a great deal of potential for cooperation in the areas of, for example, education, learning. Just over the past 2 years, there's been a lot of discussion about health, about transportation and communication, all areas where many Arctic governments, as well as organizations and peoples, for that matter, could and should be sharing information more effectively. So there is certainly a amount of goodwill now between Canada and Greenland that certainly should be taken advantage of. And may I just say quickly that I very much hope that the Canadian government is considering following the lead of others and potentially opening up diplomatic representation in Nuuk. I think that would be a great idea. Thank you.
The ambassador smiling, so perhaps he knows something we don't know. No, Monique, would you like to contribute? What are the positive outlooks?
I think there are many, but I think particularly that maybe the reason, I mean, clearly Greenland and Canada should collaborate, but I think actually you get more potential basically the further you go away from your own homestead. So I think that that this interest from places that are very dissimilar to Greenland. We see now export of water maybe into parts of the world where that is needing. We don't know whether that's going to fly or not. We have these various ideas about how we can, by short-circuiting Greenland with more tropical climates, can do something about climate change and so forth. So I think that there's a lot. We had, when I was chairman of the University of Greenland, we made a memorandum of understanding with Australian University because of remote medicine and indigenous learning and all these things in places that are very dissimilar but share some common, you could say, practical issues. So I think that, to me, what's interesting is that we have some new players that we don't usually play with, where we can release there's a greater difference, and therefore there's more energy basically to be harvested from collaboration.
Menino,
what we have experienced in the last few years, and I think Denis also experienced this in conferences and different meetings between us, that we are having very much especially the Arctic part of our countries, the same experiences. We have the same challenges, we have same opportunities, different ways of solving things, and perhaps ways where we can inspire each other. So what we are looking at and seeing is that decision makers in Canada, and very much in the northern part of Canada, are facing the same things as we are facing. And we like to know more and cooperate more. But we also want to, again, neighbors, we want to cooperate more with Canada. And this summer there will be a flight between Nuuk and Iqaluit. But there is also Ottawa and Toronto, where we've had many delegations through the years come, and also delegations from Canada coming to Greenland. And we're now seeing an increasing, also slowly increasing Canadian number of companies coming to Greenland or showing an interest in cooperation. So there's a basis now, and also the tourism part of it, we're seeing more Canadians coming, and also Greenlanders interested in going westwards. So I think there's definitely opportunities, and the time is right. It's coming together, I think, but it will still need support from the governments in order to pave the way and foster this cooperation. We have Royal Greenland, who's invested in factories also in Canada. So there is more and more, and basis for more.
So things are moving. I urge you, we have a few minutes left, so anybody who wants to say anything on any topic, there's a gentleman there who's waiting for a microphone. Thank you very much for raising your hand. Please raise it again so that people can see you. It's all yours.
Thank you. William Colgan from the Geological Survey here. Quick question under positive outlooks. Do you think 2024 will be the year that Greenland joins the Paris Agreement? No panel member in particular. I'd be interested in yes, no's, and hot takes.
Well, I think I'll leave that to Menino, because there are very recent developments in Greenland on that issue.
There was Parliament decided that yes, we must join the Paris Agreement. So now it's down to technicalities. So we are going that way. Yeah.
And can you just briefly brief us, why didn't Greenland join the Paris Agreement from the beginning?
Because we needed to analyze the mechanics of it much more, and we were not part of the negotiations from the inside. And of course, we've had some experiences also with the Kyoto Protocol that were not so good, and of course the Kyoto Protocol is much more mechanic in its approach and demands. And we had to spend money on CO2 quotas that actually didn't help us bring down our CO2 emissions in Greenland. So we've had a lot of concerns on will this stop Greenland's economic development, because we actually we have an ambition to try to bring down the block grant, the economic funds that come here from Denmark and do that with money we earn ourselves. And if we do that, then we need more activities, and more activities often bring more emissions. So there was a concern on how do we actually do this, and there was a need for a lot of detailed discussions and information gathering in a Greenland context. But it led to where we are now, that now we've decided to do this.
Thank you very much. Last intervention from the floor there.
Oh, awesome. I'm Andrew Love-Baron, sorry for my voice, still recovering from COVID. I had a question about actually food security for Arctic communities and whether there are points for optimism relative to climate change and increased urbanization of Arctic communities, or whether there's some major risks that are sort of emerging as we're seeing changes both from a climate perspective and a trade perspective with Russia and conflict broadly.
Oh, that was a big one to finalize on. But Sarah, can you do two things in one? Address the issue of positive outlooks and the gentleman's question on food security. How are we faring? Are there new opportunities that climate change is offering for increasing food security for the Arctic peoples?
I'll try and do three things, actually.
Thank you.
Because I actually wanted to just also briefly comment on the Trump question.
Please.
So for the Inuit Circumpolar Council, those nearly 5 decades that our organization has existed, we have insisted on collaborating no matter the political dynamics in each of the constituencies. And I think as a collective Arctic community on multiple levels, we should really stress, towards each other how important it is to reach a deeper understanding of the political dynamics within the different jurisdictions and constituencies. And here I would recommend us to look more to Alaska as well. I think Alaska and the government or the governance conducted and the politics conducted in Alaska are always very important and influential in how Washington deals with the Arctic. And I note positive developments that also stem from the Trump administration in the latest years in regards to Arctic development within the US because of that agency that comes from Alaska. So I think that we have a collective responsibility to not sort of look only at these things in a deficit way. This doesn't mean that I support any specific, politicians in any other country, but that we, take up that challenge of making sure to understand each other's dynamics so that we can continue to find those ways of collaborating diplomatically across the Arctic. And this actually also brings me to the Agency of the Arctic Peoples. I think that there is no doubt the Agency of the Arctic Peoples have been incredibly meaningful and important to the Arctic governance we see today. I don't believe we would have had an Arctic Council that looks like the one we have today if we hadn't had Indigenous peoples raising the concerns and the need of collaboration already from 1973 and onwards. Maybe even more earlier than that, but 1973 was the first time that Arctic Indigenous peoples got together and decided to work together side by side on developing Arctic governance. So I think that Indigenous peoples have in many ways led the way to the Arctic governance structure we have today. And now the situation we have in these years does not make it less important that we make sure that those governance structures are inclusive of Indigenous peoples, but also recognizes those that are not state entities. And on the opportunities, I would say that on the food sovereignty and security issues, food sovereignty is negatively affected by climate change. If food security is affected, is also dependent on whether supplies and supply chains are organized in a way so they take into the account the changes in the climate. So I think that there are so many different factors that play into the issue of food security. The example I raised earlier on the loss of access to hunting because of the sea ice not settling is one clear example of the loss of access to food security, but also a violation of the food sovereignty. Because what is the alternative? The alternative is to go to the store and buy, but is the supply enough? And is that food healthy for the people in mind? So there are so many things that are at play here, and I can't say that I think that climate change has a positive effect on the foods that we eat. It might give us access to hunt, fish, other species, but in the sense of making sure that the nutrition is the one that fits the biology of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, I'm more unsure of whether there are any positive effects. So I think that that's another issue that needs to be dealt with very elaborately and in recognition of the complexities that comes with food supply and food security, and not least the issue of food sovereignty. So I'll keep it at that, Rønner.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And finally, Timo, it's up to you now to have the last word, and I urge you to develop the themes and thinking on positive opportunities in 2024.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that most of us who have been working more or less with the Arctic Council for, I don't know, 20 years that I've been active in that work, I think that we certainly have now understood how important that the institution is. And I think that the positive is that with the Norwegian chairmanship, and of course after that Danish chairship, we can keep it going. So this is not to say that everything will go in a, with flying colors. That much we know. The situation is really tense, but we have been able to keep it going, and that's very important. It's also important for the other interim cooperation that we will have. So we will have bilateral treaties from outside the region with Arctic states and others. So the Arctic Council has been able to kind of create the kind of role model for all these kind of bilateral agreements that we have to always keep the indigenous peoples, for instance, in mind, whatever we do. So I think that's the positive thing that I'm seeing.
Thank you very much. And now, ladies and gentlemen, my time is up. So I'd like you, I'll ask you to help me say a thank you, not the least to Hjalte, who has not been recognized yet, but I will do so. He has made sure that everything worked. And thank you for that, Hjalte, all the technical stuff, that it worked all the way to concert and to move and forth and back without a hitch. Thank you very much. It's not very often it happens like that. Thank you. Thank you also to the staff of this place who has made it possible for us to borrow and use this wonderful room. Thank you to the organizers, the Canadian Embassy and the Danish Foreign Policy Society. And not the least, bring your hands together for the 5 people on this panel. Thank you so much. And then, as the ambassador indicated and Charlotte said, the reception is now right next to us. I can see it down there. The glasses are full. So please leave your things in the rooms back there where they are and have a glass and continue the conversation down there. Thank you very much for your attention and your contributions, not the least.
Bye-bye. Hygge jer.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Mark.
Oh, I'm recovering from COVID. Great. That was a while ago. Yes.